There is a particular kind of strategic theater that reveals more about the actor performing it than the audience it is intended to impress. What is unfolding in the Gulf of Oman right now is not a demonstration of American military dominance. It is, if one reads the operational picture with any degree of honest analytical rigor, a demonstration of the profound limitations of coercive maritime strategy when applied against an adversary that has spent 4 decades preparing precisely for this contingency. Let us begin with what is actually happening, stripped of the triumphalist narration that American Central Command's press releases are designed to produce. A Hellfire missile, fired from a rotary wing platform, almost certainly an Apache AH-64, though the distinction matters less than what its deployment reveals, struck the engine room of a Gambia-flagged commercial vessel in international waters. This vessel, the MV Leon Star, was attempting to transit toward an Iranian port. It was the fifth such vessel disabled since the blockade was imposed. 116 others were turned around through warning and compliance. 5 were struck. Read that ratio carefully. 116 complied, 5 did not. And of those 5, the United States found it necessary to physically destroy propulsion systems rather than simply assert legal authority. This tells you something that no press release will articulate plainly. The blockade is not universally respected. The legal basis for it in international waters remains deeply contested, and the operational cost of enforcing it is escalating with every vessel that decides the risk of non-compliance is worth taking. Hellfire missiles are not free. Apache helicopters require maintenance cycles, crew hours, logistical chains. More importantly, every vessel disabled in international waters, particularly those flying flags of third-party nations, creates a diplomatic and legal record that accumulates. Gambia is not Iran. The crew aboard that vessel were not Iranian military personnel. They were merchant sailors operating under commercial contract. The precedents being set here will not disappear when this crisis eventually resolves, and they will be cited repeatedly by every adversary and every neutral power the next time the United States attempts to assert maritime authority in waters that are not unambiguously American-controlled. But let us move past the tactical and into what is strategically significant about the broader operational picture emerging from the Strait of Hormuz region this week. The reported anti-aircraft activity over Keshem Island, with residents confirming detonations and imagery surfacing that appears to show drone wreckage in coastal waters, points to a pattern that has been consistent throughout this so-called ceasefire period. The IRGC has claimed engagement of an MQ-1 platform. Whether that specific attribution is accurate matters less than the operational reality it represents. Unmanned aerial systems continue to probe Iranian airspace, and Iranian air defense continues to engage them with enough regularity that at least one shoot-down per week has become almost normalized background noise in Western coverage. This normalization is itself strategically significant. When drone attrition becomes routine, it signals something important about the surveillance architecture that the United States is depending upon to maintain situational awareness over Iranian territory and adjacent waters. The MQ-1 is not a cutting-edge platform. It is a legacy reconnaissance and light attack asset. Its continued employment in contested airspace against an adversary with active and demonstrated air defense capability suggests either that more capable assets are being conserved or that the coverage requirements are so extensive that older platforms are being consumed as an acceptable cost. Neither interpretation reflects a posture of comfortable dominance. Now consider what was reported from Omani waters simultaneously. The Omani Ministry of Defense issued a navigational alert regarding a suspected naval mine within Omani territorial waters in the Strait of Hormuz. Imagery has since emerged appearing to show an Iranian influence mine positioned near the Omani coastline, reportedly in a location that would divert commercial traffic toward Iranian-controlled shipping lanes rather than the corridor currently used by the U.S. Navy to escort merchant vessels through the strait. Think carefully about what this action represents doctrinally. Mining another nation's territorial waters, if confirmed, is not a battlefield improvisation. It is a deliberate operational message. The message is layered. On one level, it demonstrates that Iran retains the capability and the willingness to impose costs on maritime transit in ways that do not require surface fleet engagement, which Iran knows it would lose. On another level, it creates a legal and diplomatic crisis for Oman, a nation that has historically served as a quiet intermediary channel between Washington and Tehran. By placing mines in Omani waters, Iran is either signaling contempt for that channel or applying pressure to Oman to restrain its cooperation with American operations in the region. There is a third interpretation that Western analysts are unlikely to feature prominently in their public assessments. The mining may be intended specifically to force a choice on the US Navy between accepting a degraded escort corridor and expanding military operations against Iranian naval assets in a way that formally breaks the ceasefire. This is escalation management through provocation, and it is a technique that requires a degree of operational sophistication that Western commentary consistently underestimates in Iranian military planning. The surface fleet Iran has left after American strikes is, by conventional metrics, substantially degraded. The destruction of larger Iranian naval platforms was real and consequential. But the IRGC naval doctrine was never built primarily around surface fleet survivability. It was built around swarm tactics, fast attack craft, anti-ship missile salvos, and area denial through mines and shore-based systems. The parade footage from Tehran this week showing PCAP-class patrol boats armed with Noor anti-ship cruise missiles is not propaganda theater for a domestic audience alone. It is a calibrated message about what the remaining Iranian naval threat architecture actually looks like. These are not ships that need to win a naval engagement. They are platforms designed to raise the cost of transit to an economically and politically unacceptable level. A fast attack boat carrying 2 anti-ship cruise missiles does not need to sink a US destroyer to achieve its strategic objective. It needs only to force the United States into a posture where every merchant vessel transiting the strait requires active naval escort, consuming surface combatant time, helicopter flight hours, maritime patrol aircraft sorties, and the attention of a carrier strike group that exists in finite numbers globally. The cost asymmetry here is not in Iran's favor in a conventional military sense, but it does not need to be. It needs only to be sufficiently painful to make the blockade economically questionable as a long-term strategy. Against this backdrop, the negotiations dimension deserves careful analysis that goes beyond the surface-level description of tougher terms and revised proposals. Multiple credible reports indicate that after Iranian counterparts failed to accept the framework that American envoys brought to the table, the Trump administration has submitted a revised proposal with substantially harder conditions, particularly regarding nuclear material disposition. The strategic logic articulated by the administration is straightforward. If Iran rejected the original terms, presenting harsher terms creates pressure to accept what was previously refused. This is a negotiating tactic with a coherent theoretical basis. It is also a tactic with a significant operational risk that is rarely discussed with appropriate seriousness. The IRGC, as an institution, does not calculate national interest through the same framework that Western negotiators assume. Its organizational survival, its influence within the Iranian power structure, and its ideological self-conception are all bound up in a narrative of resistance to external pressure. When external pressure intensifies, the institutional incentive within the IRGC is not to capitulate, it is to demonstrate that resistance is viable. Every drone that gets shot down, every mine that gets laid, every ship that forces a hellfire strike feeds that internal institutional narrative. Tougher American terms may not compress Iranian decision-making toward acceptance. They may instead provide political cover for elements within the Iranian system that prefer escalation to a deal that requires visible concessions. The fighter jet activity reported over Karaj and the increased air patrol tempo observed over Baghdad adjacent areas adds another layer to this reading. Iranian F-4 Phantoms and MiG-21 variants in the air simultaneously with heavy anti-aircraft activity and drone shootdowns does not describe a military going through the motions of routine patrol. It describes a military on heightened readiness, practicing the integration of air defense and interceptor responses in an environment where the threat picture is active and multidirectional. These are old airframes, yes. Their combat effectiveness against modern fourth-generation fighters is extremely limited. But they are not being flown to engage American F-35s. They are being flown to extend radar coverage, to communicate readiness publicly, and to practice the command integration that would matter in a more general escalation. The footage now emerging from inside Iran, the ballistic missile misfire during earlier phases of the conflict, the IRGC projectile that failed catastrophically on launch, carries a significance that cuts in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, it documents genuine degradation in Iranian precision strike capability. A ballistic missile that misfires and returns to the ground near its own launch position represents a systems failure that has operational consequences. On the other hand, the fact that this footage is only now becoming accessible, as internet restrictions apparently begin to develop fractures through which information is leaking, tells us something about the information control environment inside Iran that is strategically relevant. Sustained information suppression is one of the tools through which the Iranian government has historically managed domestic narrative during military crises. The emergence of footage that was clearly filmed weeks earlier during active combat phases suggests that the architecture of that suppression is experiencing stress. Whether that stress is sufficient to translate into meaningful domestic political pressure on the Iranian leadership is a separate analytical question with a highly uncertain answer. Iranian governments have survived extraordinary levels of internal discontent. The IRGC's internal security function is not primarily oriented toward external threats. But a fracturing information environment does complicate the government's ability to control the narrative about how the war's first phase actually unfolded. And that matters for whatever negotiating dynamic eventually emerges. What we are observing across all of these data points simultaneously is not a situation moving cleanly toward resolution. The blockade is holding in the sense that the majority of vessels comply, but it is not holding in the sense of eliminating Iranian agency in the maritime domain. Iranian air defenses are active and successfully engaging American unmanned systems. Iranian naval doctrine continues to probe the cost structure of American escort operations. The diplomatic track is absorbing increasingly harsh American demands against a backdrop of Iranian institutional resistance. And the information environment inside Iran is beginning to show strains that could either accelerate pressure toward a deal or generate internal dynamics that make any deal politically more difficult for Iranian leaders to accept. The American strategic position in the Gulf of Oman is not weak in any conventional military sense. The United States possesses overwhelming conventional military superiority in this theater. But conventional military superiority does not automatically translate into the ability to impose a desired political outcome on an adversary that has structured its entire strategic posture around denying that translation. This is the fundamental tension that has defined American military power projection in the greater Middle East region for the better part of 4 decades. Superiority in the engagement, uncertainty in the campaign, instability in the outcome. The Hellfire missile that struck the engine room of the MV Leon Star on May 29th will generate a press release noting another successful blockade enforcement action. What it will not generate is a strategic solution to the underlying problem, which is that Iran has not yet concluded that the cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of accepting American terms, and nothing visible in the current operational picture suggests that calculation is about to change. The ceasefire as a concept deserves more analytical scrutiny than it is currently receiving in mainstream coverage. A ceasefire is conventionally understood as a mutual suspension of offensive military action pending diplomatic resolution. What is observable in the Gulf of Oman and across Iranian airspace right now does not comfortably fit that definition. Drones are being shot down at a pace that has become statistically routine. Mines are appearing in the territorial waters of neutral third parties. Commercial vessels are being struck with precision munitions in international waters. Fighter aircraft are maintaining elevated patrol tempos over major Iranian population centers. If this is a ceasefire, it is one that both sides are treating primarily as a framework for continuing the conflict through means that preserve formal deniability while accumulating operational advantage.